So welcome, Filip. And
Thank you. Thank you. My name is, as Ulrika said, Filip Skärin. I'm from Jönköping University. This is also my first time at this conference, so it's nice to see all you new people for me. But I will do this presentation about research that I have done together with my colleagues Skärin and Annelise Andersen. And the focus is on circularity practices in Swedish manufacturing companies, focusing on what is actually being done at this very moment. As you also saw from this previous presentation, is that there is a huge need for circularity. We need to transition from a linear economy towards a more circular economy, where we try to sort of extend the lifetime of the resources that we take from planet Earth. And this is, of course, related to the global climate crisis, and especially for manufacturing companies, whereas of 2020, for instance, in the US, manufacturing companies were responsible for 23% of the total CO2e emissions. And in Sweden, this was even higher, going up to 32% of the total CO2e emissions. And normally, when we talk about circular economy, we talk about these beautiful futuristic visions of how we should do this, how should we maximize the resource utilization, how should we bring back products and resources and components to the manufacturers and bring new life to them again. But we're not really there yet. We're quite far away from that reality. So what we wanted to do in our research was to see, okay, what is actually being done at this very moment? What are Swedish manufacturing companies doing in terms of circularity? And what could that be, how can that be explained? So then we had the idea of looking at sustainability reports. So we did that for 20 largest manufacturing companies in Sweden. And the purpose with this was twofold. Firstly, we wanted to explore if Swedish manufacturing companies actually are circular, but also to see what circularity practices are mentioned in these types of reports or in these reports. And by circularity practices, I mean what is actually being done. What are the specific actions related to circularity that are mentioned in these kind of reports? And also on the side, since this is a public document, saying also, is this used for greenwashing? Are companies taking advantage of this mandatory document to show off what they have been doing in a sort of greenwashing manner? And for you who don't know what sustainability reports are, it is a mandatory document if you fulfill 2 out of 3 requirements. So, and this was as of 2017 new regulation, so it's fairly new for companies. But for Swedish manufacturing companies, if they have a total asset of more than 175 million SEK, if they have a net sales of more than 350 million SEK, and if they have 250 employees or more, then they need to create this sustainability report. And I think most of you already know this. But it can be either a separate document or it can be sort of a standalone document or included in the annual report, I should say. But the big issue with this sustainability report is that the Swedish regulations are not really sort of specific enough regarding what it should include. And there are quite vague requirements to what this sustainability report actually can include and should include, which means that if we want to measure how companies are doing, that can be quite difficult. So, as we are researchers, we try to at least base this on some theoretical foundation. And instead of going towards the butterfly diagram from the MacArthur Foundation that I showed previously with the nice loops, we try to do this 10-hour framework, as we call it, which presents different sort of strategies to achieve circularity. So in this one, we can see that in the yellow part, it's what Matthias was talking about with the recycling. It's about making the most of what you got when you have a product that is no longer useful in any other way. In the blue one, it's sort of prolonging the lifetime of the products that you produce through certain actions. In the green one, we are looking at partly the reduced part, looking at the manufacturing, saying how can we increase the resource utilization, how can we be more efficient within our manufacturing operations. And also rethinking how are we actually offering products and then also refusing to sort of put certain products with certain functions on the market. And this is, of course, a great theory and all of that. But what we believe was kind of missing in this is a broad picture. So we wanted to see, okay, if we don't focus only on the product, but we look at everything that a company uses, all the resources that a company uses, because that is actually what we believe that circular economy is. It's about extending the lifetime of all the resources that is actually used by companies, basically, and by everyone. So we try to expand this theory to include other areas as well by looking at these sustainability reports. And we did this in kind of 3 steps. So in the first step, we did an overarching categorization. And this is actually bigger than I imagined when I did the slide. So then we tried to make these categorizations of what could, for instance, then reduce include, what type of resources could that include, to provide a sort of a bigger picture. And that is, of course, what is mentioned in these sustainability reports that companies actually are doing at this very moment. And then if you look at, for instance, this reduced energy usage, we also wanted to see, okay, what within each of these categories is actually being used or is actually being done. And then we wanted to sort of summarize that and make a detailed description of how can we, in this case, reduce energy usage? How can Swedish manufacturing companies do this? And how is this being done at this very moment? And we thought that that would be a great way to sort of, for companies to use as a source of inspiration, because we cannot achieve circularity on our own. It's about collaboration, it's about learning from each other what other people are doing, what other companies are doing, and sharing that knowledge with each other. So that's what we try to do for all of these. And of course, the reduced energy usage is a very broad one. If we look at, for instance, repurposed packaging materials, then there's few ways to possibly achieve that. And then in one final step, since we are also focusing very much on manufacturing and production, we also wanted to zoom in on production and sort of remove all the other circularity practice categories that weren't related to what is actually going on directly within production. So everything that's going on upstreams and downstreams at the suppliers and the customers and so on. And then we were left with a couple of these, which we tried to also quantify, saying how many of these 20 largest Swedish manufacturing companies are actually saying that they, for instance, reduce greenhouse gas emissions through some activity. So we did this in 2 different categorizations. So we had the VP, which stands for, no, I'm almost falling down, visualized and planned. So that's a sort of a practice that they write that, oh, we intend to do this. We have a plan to, let's say, reduce our CO2 emissions by this amount within a certain years. We also have the OR, which is the ongoing or already realized actions, which means that this is something that the company is reporting has already been done before. And what we learned from this was quite interesting. Quantitatively, the 3 most common practices were very general. So that's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's about reducing the generated waste within production then, of course, and also reusing materials within production. But what's interesting about this is that it's still, even though they are very broad, it's still only half of the companies that are actually reporting this, that they are actually doing this. And also on the other side, we see that it's sort of, when it comes to circularity practices related to the product, related to the blue circularity practices that I mentioned before, then we can see that it's even fewer. It's very few companies that are actually working with, for instance, remanufacturing or repurposing the product to extend the lifetime, offering that as a solution. So we have a far way to go here. We cannot sort of rely on these theories that sort of provides a very nice picture of what we should do and where we want to go if we are still in the very early phases of going towards a circular economy. But I thought I'd also try to summarize a little bit, because we try to sort of make, as I said before, a detailed description and a general description of each of these strategies or each of these Rs. I'm thinking I should briefly go through each of these one and sort of summarize and take some key components and key parts from each of them. So when it's about refusing, which is the very first one that the theory talks about, then it's about refusing to go forward with harmful materials, with non-recyclable materials, and also with these non-renewable resources. An example of this is, for instance, Essity, who started to use these tissues from wheat straw, which is a residual material from agriculture. So instead of using, for instance, plastic or any other type of material, they use that instead. And rethink is about, for instance, then, rethink the way that we enable customer sustainability. And a good way that was reported was using, for instance, this environmental product declaration, which provides full transparency into the CO2 impacts, for instance, or the environmental impact of the product throughout its life cycle. So being more transparent in that way. And also, as I said before, we cannot reach circularity or circular economy on our own. So initiating collaboration that supports circularity is also a key component here. When it comes to reduce, then this can also be, this was found to be sort of as a consequence of other activities. It's a very broad strategy to say. But here we found that it can be, for instance, focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, energy usage, water usage, waste, etc. And reusing is about saying what can be reused within the manufacturing facility. How can we reuse the heat or the steam that comes out of our machines? How can we reuse packaging materials in a smart way? How can we reuse the water that we use, and so on? And that's sort of creating a second lifetime of these kind of resources within the factory. And an example of this is, for instance, Holmen, who says that they reuse steam from their own production then, sort of in the drying processes for the sawmills. So it's a good way of sort of something occurring, a resource or something coming up in the production, and you reuse that instead of just letting it go to waste and not utilizing it. And the same way goes for SSAB, who sort of recirculate their materials or their sort of metals or materials generated in their production back into their own manufacturing facility again. And regarding these, the repair, refurbish, remanufacture, and repurpose, as I said before, these were quite scarcely reported in this, which was quite surprising. Not a lot of companies seem to work with remanufacturing or seem to work with repurposing and so on. But we had some good examples of this. For instance, both Volvo Group and Ericsson have dedicated buyback programs where they sort of buy back used products from the customer, renovate them, refurbish them, or remanufacture them, and so then give them a second life and then bring them back to the market again. And same thing goes for other companies doing this. For instance, when it comes to repurposing, I think ABB had a good case of what you can do with sort of packaging material. So in their case, they bought a second-hand cardboard shredder and reused sort of packaging materials that otherwise would have gone to incineration or gone to recycling. They used that as padding for outgoing packaging. So creating a second life of a resource that otherwise would have sort of been just incinerated. And then lastly, recycling and also recovering. But recycling, which is kind of the last option before incineration of a certain material or component. And here, there was a lot of talk about modularization or a modular product design to sort of enable this, an easy disassembly process, which is also what Matthias talked about. But also this again with creating close collaboration, creating these industrial symbiosis. And we found that in quite a few sustainability reports, a lot of companies starting to do this, initiating different ways of collaborating, not only with suppliers and customers, but also across the industry, across the Swedish manufacturing industry, to sort of create a circular economy together. And I think a good example of this was ABB Stina Recycling, Combitech, and Electrolux, who sort of had a pilot project focusing on improving the recycling process for electrical products. But yeah, that was it. I think I'm almost up 20 minutes. But what did we learn from this? We learned four main things. So first of all, we learned that circular practices are often quite vaguely described in these reports. It was quite difficult to see, okay, what is actually being done in detail. And second of all, there is no greenwashing, so that's great. But on the other hand, I think the sustainability reports can actually be a very good way for companies to learn from each other, for communicating with each other, what is being done, what are we doing, how can we sort of help each other in achieving circular economy. So focusing on what has been done, how has this been done, and also, most importantly, what improvements did it lead to? Did it lead to CO2 emissions? Did it lead to that we actually gain money from this? And I think that's a really good way to do this communication, this open communication. What is also interesting to see is that there's sort of a seldom an explicit, comprehensive circular strategies. It's kind of scattered all over the place. It's not that, okay, we look at our product and then we create sort of a life cycle perspective throughout that and create a large sort of strategy for how we should manage our products and how we should manage the resources within production to a larger scale. And then, as I said before, it's a huge potential in learning what other companies do. The sustainability report is a mandatory document, so might as well use that to continue to help each other and continue to learn. And this was just briefly what we have sort of found in our research. And if you want to read more, I have links to research papers that we have done. And this is the contact information to my colleagues. And to me, if you have any questions, please just ask me during the conference or send me an email or call me. And that's about it.
Thank you very much, Filip. Very interesting. And now, any reflections? And we will use this microphone as we are streaming.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I have a question about, when we talk about circular economy, a big part of circular economy is durability of the product, how durable the product is. I'm not talking about reuse of the product, but how durable the product will. And then the other big part is the business model that we do, like product services and the other ones. Did you find any a reflection of those two areas in the reports? As I understood, there was not much into we made the change so our product lasts, instead of 5 years, lasts 6 years or something like that. There was not that much of reflection over that. And also we changed our business model, so instead of selling the product, we lease it out or rent it out. Were there any indication in the reports about those two? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Regarding the durability, there was quite limited focus, like specific focus on the product and describing the product per se. Mostly about sort of what practices are surrounding the product, instead of saying that, oh, we have done these certain things to extend the durability of the product. And regarding the business models, there were a few companies that mentioned that they have started to look at new ways of offering their products, new ways of sort of having products as a service or similar. So I think that's on the rise. That's one way to move forward within a circular economy, the sharing economy. But still, like very limitedly reported, at least in these sustainability reports.
Hello, thank you, Filip. I will certainly read your articles. How about the manufacturing equipment? Did many of the companies mention that, and how they maintain them to be long life and so on? Was that a big topic?
Very good question, because that's also what I'm mainly interested in, the manufacturing equipment. And basically, no company mentioned that specifically. There was a few out of all these companies that mentioned it briefly, but nothing in general. So there was a clear lack on that perspective. And I think that's a huge room for improvement. How do we sort of look at the production equipment? How do we ensure that they have a long lifetime as well?
Well, I had a question regarding the comparison. Have you done any comparisons between the different types of companies or SMEs or type?
No, maybe in the future. But SMEs are not really mandatory to write the sustainability reports. So you kind of have to look at large enterprises. But we haven't looked at any industry specific. We only looked at Swedish manufacturing companies. But I think that's for sure interesting to compare different industry with each other, see how far certain industry have come, because I think that you can learn a lot from that as well.
Because I was also thinking that you're dependent of each other in working in this direction, so it could be quite interesting to follow up with further studies.
Yeah.
Hello. Have you investigated any connections to these governmental programs, Fossilfritt Sverige?
No. Short answer. We have not. Yes, we should.
Thank you.